Well, hey, I'm Jeff, your tabletop tech here in the Dice Tower, and folks, it's time for a shakedown. Alright, hopefully by now you've seen a number of my reviews here on the channel, but these shakedown reviews are going to be more streamlined. I'll cover the rules as I go, but the idea here is to tell you how it feels to play these games after a few solid playthroughs, and let you decide if it's something that you want to look further into. And I thought it made sense for my first shakedown to take a look at Thunder Rolls by Richard Launius. I've heard that Richard is a pretty big racing fan, and in fact I heard this from an employee at Boardwalk, a board game store in Greenville, South Carolina, where my wife and I have always loved to visit. Apparently he lives nearby that store, and as a result a number of the staff of that store helped out with playtesting this game during its development, and that's probably why Boardwalk is featured in a number of places within this game. So I've got to say that knowing all that, I went into this game with pretty high expectations. Alright, let's open her up. Thunder Rolls has an emphasis on stock car racing, and it has a large two-sided board, one side with an oval track and one with sort of a road course. The game plays anywhere from 1 to 8 players, but you'll always have 8 cars on the track, thanks to a slew of cards dedicated solely to running AI or non-player driver cars. Thunder Rolls plays out over 2 phases with interludes, as the rulebook calls them, following each phase. The first phase uses dice, and you'll roll all the dice that you have, and then choose one of the 6 actions printed right on the main board to activate with all the dice you rolled matching that number in this turn. You'll place the dice on that action space, take that action, and then the next player goes. All these actions are fairly straightforward. You can move 2 spaces. You can trigger a maneuver such as swapping positions with another car in front of you, or you can do something a smidge unique like taking one of these crew chief cards, which you can play at various times throughout the game to give yourself a unique benefit. There's also a pit stop space which lets you refresh your player board. You can flip over your player board on your turn to re-roll any of your dice, but you'll have to revisit the pit stop space using a number 1 die before you can refresh this player board to do it again. In addition, any players that don't visit the pit stop at least once during the rolling phase will have to take a penalty, possibly quite a severe one, before going into the Thunder phase. Now, I want to talk about the non-player drivers, since unless you manage to cram 8 people around the table, you'll always be fielding at least a few of these during your game. There are 2 pages in the rulebook that explain how these cars activate and move on their turns, and after each player has taken their singular turn during the rolling phase, you'll then reveal each card of this non-player driver stack, then reveal another card from the non-player driver action deck, and move each car as directed between the 2 cards. Some of these cards provide a simple movement or a single maneuver, but some of them will trigger a driver's special action, which is printed on the driver card and has to be triggered in a specific order. I'll get back to these in a little bit, but spoiler alert, these things are quite fiddly if you're using any more than a few of them, and however many constitutes a few will obviously differ from player to player. Anyway, after all players have used all of their dice, you'll then prepare for the Thunder phase. You'll check each of these 6 action spaces from the rolling phase, and whichever players played the top 3 counts of dice onto each space will get to choose, in order of the most dice played, one of the 3 Thunder cards which were placed beneath the board during setup. If more than one player has played the same number of dice to an action space, the preference goes to whichever player played that number of dice earlier in this phase. Now at this point, players who have more than 4 Thunder cards will choose 4 of them to keep, but any player who has less than 4 cards will draw speed cards until they have a total of 4 cards. You then move into the Thunder phase. The Thunder phase works a bit like programming. Players will choose the order in which they want to play these 4 cards and lay them out in that order at the start of the Thunder phase. Players may also have hazard cards which can be gathered a number of ways, and these will limit the abilities on these Speed and Thunder cards. There are a bit more rules to these, but suffice to say these can be really bad to have. Players will then resolve their leftmost Thunder or Speed card one at a time. In general, the movement and the maneuvers that you're taking in the Thunder phase are far more significant than what you were able to do in the rolling phase, especially for those Thunder cards. The Speed cards are usually a bit more diluted than the Thunder cards, but they will still give you more to do than what you were able to accomplish back in the rolling phase. Again here though, you have to reveal an action card for each of your non-player drivers, and they will be just as adept at zooming around the track, knocking each other and other players backwards. Once each player has resolved all 4 of their cards in the Thunder phase, you'll go into a scoring interlude, which is slightly different depending on the length of your game. The combination of rolling interlude, Thunder interlude phases is called a stage, and you'll play either 1 or 2 stages depending on the race card you've chosen for your playthrough. And since I'm here, let me go ahead and start my review with talking about these race cards. These cards are intended to turn the 2 sides of this board into a variety of different tracks and or racing events. But they don't really give that impression. Each one of these just adds significant rules overhead to each game of Thunder rolls that you play. They might restrict certain movements or change any of these 6 actions from the rolling phase, and they'll also add different rules for these orange and blue triangle spaces on either side of the board. These don't at all make you feel like you're on a different track. All they make you feel like is you have a bunch of new rules to remember, and honestly, they're a bit of a disappointment. The 2 different phases of the game feel utterly detached from one another. You can certainly try to focus your effort on getting the Thunder cards that you want from each of these 6 action spaces, but even then, it's really up to the dice as to whether or not you'll be successful. In addition, these rolling phase actions are very underwhelming, and they also don't really change. There might be slight alterations at the hands of these race card events, but they might just add a movement or remove a movement. It's very, very minimal from game to game. I really like the crew chief cards as they can provide a bit of flexibility, but you get so few of them even in a 2-stage race that they feel severely underutilized. The Thunder phase can be a lot more active, a lot more engaging, and even a bit quicker, but again, there are those hazard cards, which can really decimate a player on one of their turns. I was neck and neck with a buddy going into the Thunder phase until he revealed a hazard card that made him move 2 spaces backwards and then forced him to trash the card that he had underneath it, accomplishing nothing else in that turn. When the AI cards are moving 7 spaces on a single turn, it can be really disparaging for a player to get punished that harshly on their turn. And again, I get that maybe that's good racing, but it's not necessarily good tabletop gaming, if we're honest. And then, of course, there are the non-player drivers. These things come in 2 different flavors, Rookie and Pro. I've only ever played against the Rookies, and even then, a number of them have still beaten human players by the end of the race. These things feel so incredibly unbalanced, especially because in a number of actions, they will outperform anything that a player can do in a single turn of either the rolling or the Thunder phase. I really have to wonder if there was so much participation in the playtesting of this game that these things just didn't really get mathed out. They're also incredibly fiddly, especially if you're playing with a number of these things in a single game. My first game of this was 2 human players with 6 AI drivers, and I felt like so much of the time that we spent when we didn't have our heads buried in the rulebook were just spent controlling these stupid cars. Speaking of the rulebook, it's really difficult to follow and even more difficult to find answers in. And that's a bit surprising since this rulebook repeats itself quite a bit in its 24 pages, and yet almost immediately I was faced with a number of questions that I could not find answers to, especially for those non-player driver cars, which can often find themselves in scenarios that this rulebook just does not clarify. We also had an action card, a Thunder card that I think was a Kickstarter card, and there was no explanation for its maneuver in this rulebook. We had to stop and go online to try and find an answer. And I gotta tell you, in a racing game where you're supposed to be fast-paced and chaotic, to have to stop everything and go online to find clarifications for a rule just absolutely kills the mood of the game. And on that note, I'm going to say that this just did not make me feel at all like a racing game. This felt like a roll and flip to move game. I never cared about my speed into a corner or if I was braking or if I was on the right line or my position with the other cars. Most of it was just spent trying to stay ahead of those AI drivers, which became more and more difficult to do. The components here, by the way, are okay. The biggest disappointment here are these chibi cars, as I've come to call them. When you first get this game, all the cars will look like this, plain white basic plastic, and it does come with stickers that you can use to distinguish each of the cars, but I've seen the way they look, and they look pretty terrible. You're going to really want a base coat of paint in each of the 8 colors that comes in the game to make these things stand out and look a little better. Now, I couldn't do it without a spray paint, and that alone would add another $40 to the cost of this game. You could probably get by with a brush. I know I don't have those skills. And don't get me wrong, I love that they've included stickers, especially the ones featuring publishers, stores, and other games. But I'd have really preferred to see each car in a base color to start with. It is quite possible that this game plays very differently with 8 people sitting around the table, but I am never going to get to experience that. I will never be able to get 8 people sitting around the table of this game. Honestly, racing around here just is not as popular as those fantasy dungeon crawlers or those champagne dry Euro games. And you can solo this game, but honestly, you could not pay me enough to do so. There is so much fiddle factor in those AI drivers and so much rules overhead from these race events that I just have no interest in trying to do so. Honestly, my verdict at this point is that it's a good thing this game came out just a few months before the game of Heat, because nothing in this game compares to Heat, not by a monster mile. That's it for me, folks. I'll catch you again next time. Cheers. Move 1. All right, your turn, Fred. No, Fred's in the bathroom.